Thank you very much. It's a delight to be with you. Greetings from Providence Church in Pensacola, Florida. I'm starting to believe there's a conspiracy among presiding ministers. And must pastor a church named Providence Church in order to assume this role. Wonderful to be with you. I've been following the ministry of Providence here for quite some time, so it's a delight to put a face and some flesh to the things I've seen from afar. If I told you this evening that there was a man who was hated by one of the greatest tyrants of history, by the name of Adolf Hitler, this man was hated even though he had been dead for 20 years already. Kuyper died in the 1920s. Hitler rose to power in the late 30s, early 40s. Hitler viewed Kuyper as one of the greatest antagonists of the mission he had, which was to cleanse the Aryan race. And as we know the story, one of the greatest murderers and tyrants of all history. There was one man that Hitler feared above all others, a man who had already been in the grave for 2 decades, a man who rose to power in the Netherlands, and you would think by the size of the Netherlands, would not cause any fright or fear to a man such as Adolf Hitler, but he did. Adolf Hitler feared Abraham Kuyper because Abraham Kuyper was doing things that was threatening Hitler's reign, Hitler's trajectory in history. In fact, there was a season of life that Hitler said that he was to order that every man who graduated from the Free University of Amsterdam to be killed because they posed a threat to what he was pursuing in Germany. That man was Abraham Kuyper. What I want to do this evening as we enter into the subject of Abraham Kuyper, the man Abraham Kuyper, is I want to begin by sharing a little bit of how I became interested in the life of this Dutch theologian by the name of Abraham Kuyper. In 2005, I became closely connected with a professor in Orlando by the name of John Frame when I was in seminary at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando. His classes weren't as enthusiastic as I would like them to have been, but he had a very cohesive vision of the world, and it was fascinating. So one day I had the boldness to walk into his office, and I asked him if he'd be willing to guide me through an independent study on Abraham Kuyper. I had read Kuyper before, but I wasn't very knowledgeable about who he was, what he had accomplished. So I thought I'd kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and so I would read and write about Kuyper in regular conversation with this professor whom I deeply admired by the name of John Frame. It was the best of both worlds. That was the birth of my interest in this Dutch theologian and his legacy, which we'll be considering the next day or two. For that independent study, I had to write a very lengthy paper, and it was the hardest I had ever worked for 2 credits in seminary. I wrote in the first line of that paper on Kuyper the following 17, 18 years ago. I wrote, Abraham Kuyper's Calvinism is a loud call to cultural engagement. Abraham Kuyper's Calvinism is a loud call to cultural engagement. And after all the additional reading I have done in these last 20 years, 20 plus years, that's still probably the best summary I can offer you of the life of Abraham Kuyper. That his life was a loud call, not a timid call, but a loud call to cultural engagement. Who was Abraham Kuyper? Kuyper built his entire system in the strong Calvinistic tradition of Calvin and Geneva, and building upon that tradition since those days. 3 centuries of Calvinistic tradition had been already laid before the path of Abraham Kuyper before he even enters into the scene. He was the man who was, according to one scholar, the first Christian in a profound way to come to grips with a world that was being transformed. Abraham Kuyper influenced the political, the theological, the sociological, the cultural, and the educational history of the Western world. I know that's a very bold statement if you're hearing about this man for the first time, but I think the more you learn about him in today and tomorrow, the more valid that assertion is. And I want to offer you a little bit of a sense of where we are historically so you can see where Abraham Kuyper fits into this historical narrative. I want to begin by offering just a little simple outline of history. It is simple because these words, they kind of come together, as you'll see. History, in my estimation, can be summarized in 4 stages. History can be summarized in 4 stages. The church is formed, the church is deformed, the church is reformed, and then the church is transformed. 4 stages: formed, deformed, reformed, and transformed. History flows in this 4-fold pattern. This is how I want you to view and embrace the past, the present, and the future of the church. We are currently, in my estimation, in the season of the history of the church where the church is being transformed. We could even say it's being conformed into the life of Jesus. And when the church is transformed, everything around the church is also going to be transformed. The church's culture, eventually for good or ill, is going to form the basis of civilization. So the culture around the world, around the church, outside the church, is going to be transformed on the basis of the church's role and her calling before the world. Simply put, as the church goes, so goes the culture. And I believe, again, another bold assertion, that at the end of history, we will look back and see the name Abraham Kuyper as a very central figure in this transformative season of the history of the church. Why? Well, because Kuyper, among many things, really put a fullness into the system of Calvinism developed in the 16th century. He made Calvinism respectable again. Calvinism, in his days, as the 19th century in the Netherlands, Calvinism had fallen in hard places. The Dutch Reformed Church, which is the national church of the Netherlands, had been overtaken by modernism and skepticism. They had a national church, and that church had completely been corrupted by these corrosive ideologies. And Kuyper worked very hard, together with the other confessionalists, those who upheld Reformational history. He worked very hard to bring an Orthodox Calvinism back to the Netherlands. Now here's where I want to stop and just simply define for you what I mean by Calvinism, because there are many definitions of Calvinism. I want to give you Kuyper's definition of Calvinism. Kuyper says that Calvinism is, very simply, an all-embracing system of principles. An all-embracing system of principles. So Kuyper develops a theology on the basis of Calvinism that affirms, essentially, the absolute sovereignty of God over everything in heaven above or earth below. An all-embracing system of principles, as we'll see. Calvin's disciples in the 16th century in Geneva, his disciples like Theodore Beza, for example, they tried to continue that Calvinistic vision. But it's very safe to say that the Calvinistic ideal in the 16th century, the ideal of building a society based on the fabric of heaven, that ideal was lost not many years after the death of Geneva's pastor, John Calvin. But it began in many ways to re-emerge in the missionary movement of the 18th and 19th centuries. It gave new life to Calvinism. In fact, the greatest missionary of the last 300 years, by the name of William Carey, was both a Calvinist and a post-millennialist. Meaning, he brought the idea of the sovereignty of God and the glory of God in bringing the nations in submission to Jesus Christ. He brought both of these ideas together, the sovereignty of God and the transformative nature of the gospel in changing the world. And it was during these glorious missiological days, the history of the church, of William Carey and many others, that on October 29th, and we're almost on that day, we're only 9 days from October 29th, 1837, was born Abraham Kuyper. Abraham Kuyper. Kuyper was homeschooled by his father, Frederick Kuyper. Frederick Kuyper was a minister in the National Church of the Netherlands, the Dutch Reformed Church. His father, let's say, was mildly orthodox, as one scholar puts it. In other words, he wasn't the kind of guy who would come to you and push orthodoxy. He wouldn't come to you and tell you that you ought to subscribe to the three forms of unity, or to the Heidelberg Catechism, to any of the famous Reformed confessions of the day. He was, in many ways, ironic to a fault. He held to a privatized faith. And it's very interesting, if you compare the life of Abraham Kuyper's father and Abraham Kuyper's life afterwards, that Abraham Kuyper, in many ways, did everything that his father didn't. He fought against the very things his father believed in, which was not only a mild orthodoxy, but various forms of modernism. Kuyper was remarkable. As an undergraduate, he studied ancient languages, which were already in addition to the languages he spoke. He already spoke English, he already spoke French, he already spoke German, he already spoke Dutch, so he said, why not 3 more? He had very strict study habits. He avoided distractions, he pursued his studies with remarkable diligence, and his academic persistence began quite early, and it bore a lot of fruit. You can see that his academic consistency would place the groundwork for the kind of academic consistency he would have throughout his life. And it was right at the end of his graduation that he became engaged to Hendrika Schei. He married her in 1863. Now remember, Kuyper was homeschooled by his father, trained by his father, and as he got older, he became, as a result, very enamored by the things his father had taught him. In this case, modernism, skepticism. And one of the common themes of these ideologies was that you are to treasure human reason, you are to prize human reason above everything else, above revelation, above the confessions. Human reason is the greatest of all things, and you are to trust in the logic of human reason. And where human reason leads you is where you should go, so that the human constitution is constantly evolving on issues, never settling on an authoritative word, but constantly evolving. Man arrives at his own conclusions without supernatural aid. Now, of course, what this does is it eliminates the necessity of miracles. If there is no supernatural aid involved, then we live in a world where miracles don't happen. These things are not possible. Kuyper talks about an example when he was studying where he and his classmates stood up and gave a standing ovation to one of the professors who declared quite boldly that there is no conceivable way in which Jesus would have risen from the dead. Miracles don't exist. And Kuyper entered into that world. He embraced it wholeheartedly in his early academic days. He writes later on, in reflecting back on this season of his life, he says, in the academic world, I had no defense against the powers of theological negation. He says, I was robbed of the confession of faith. He says, I was unconverted, I was proud, and I doubted everything. His doctoral dissertation, which I had just a small chance of peeking through, his doctoral dissertation was on John Calvin, of all people. And he believed that Calvin was a kind of modernist. He reinvented Calvin after his own image. He was a modernist, a skeptic of sorts. And by the end of his dissertation, he despised Calvin. He framed him after his image, and at the end he hated him even more. But interestingly enough, he says later on that his exposure to the writings of John Calvin, in particular in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, he said it was there where he began to consider the role of divine providence, the role of a God who is very much intricately involved in the affairs of man. He had hated the idea that God was sovereign over everything. He hated the idea that God was sovereign over human will, but eventually he realized that what he believed in was merely his attempt at fleeing from the reality that God is sovereign. That what the Bible taught and what the confessions taught were actually true indeed. But remember, Kuyper had been trained in the school of higher criticism. He had been trained to doubt everything. And he received even further confirmation of his doubts in his years of academic pursuits. Now, as you can imagine, that amount of unchristian thinking doesn't undo itself overnight. As I said, he was a very gifted scholar. His work ethic was the work ethic of a genius. He would work himself into physical and mental exhaustion. And he wanted to use his academic prowess to be a great professor. That was his great dream, to use everything he had learned, his doubts, his modernism, to show the world just how brilliant he was and how powerful an impression he would make in the affairs of the academy. So he said, I want to pursue a professorship. But the problem is that in those days, in order to pursue a role of such magnitude in Dutch society, you needed to have funding. He didn't have any funding. There was no money. And so since he couldn't be a professor, he said, I will be a pastor instead. He became a minister. And after he was married, he moved to this very cute little Dutch town, a rural town, the place where you would not expect to have any academician, just good farmers. And that's where he came to his first pastor in 1863. And he said, these folks are not academics, so I will teach them how to think about everything. I will put my modernism, my skepticism on display in my preaching and in my teaching. And by the end of my time with them, they will all be converts to modernism and skepticism. But, as in any good congregation, there were some very outspoken people, especially in the Dutch tradition. And these outspoken people had very little tolerance for Abraham Kuyper's modernism and skepticism. And they said that his preaching was absolutely unacceptable because it was not grounded in the authority of the Bible. Now think about this little country church, among whom had very little academic exposure, filled with humble people eager to put their faith into practice, while the church scene in the Netherlands was completely overwhelmed by liberalism, abandonment of Reformed confessions. This little church, this little country rural church, challenged Kuyper in the fundamental issues of the faith. Because for those members, they may not have been academicians, but they knew of the liberalism that was rampant in the Dutch Reformed Church. So for them, Kuyper was just another old liberal bringing his rubbish modernist ideas to the scene. They had no tolerance for it. In fact, it is very known in a lot of the biographies of Kuyper that when he would do his common pastoral visitations, there were many, many members of the congregations who would not let him even step into their homes. You are not welcome here because you're not bringing good news. The great scholar, the great Abraham Kuyper, known for his prowess, for his intellectual pursuits, was challenged little by this humble, non-scholarly congregation. And he wrote later to a friend a letter concerning that little church, and he said that church's unremitting perseverance has become the greatest blessing of my heart. He ended up serving several congregations after that before going into the political world, but that little congregation affected him tremendously. In fact, you might say, even converted our proud, modernist, non-miracle affirming scholar. His time as a minister cultivated a very deep sense of Christian action, because these congregants, they knew their Heidelberg Catechism. They knew what their comfort was in life and in death. They knew what the gospel required of them. They knew the law quite well. Kuyper ended up receiving much instruction from these congregants, and that inspired him to think about the gospel not so merely in propositional categories, but also in terms of actions based on principles. What are the principles that I'm going to articulate that is going to allow the common individual, the common parishioner, to pursue change and transformation in their environment wherever they may be? Kuyper regarded Christianity as far more than just a mere doctrine of personal salvation. Jesus in my heart. Kuyper affirmed that and believed that Christianity was far beyond that internalized idea. He believed in original sin, but he also believed that the Christian faith needs a comprehensive vital show, which is a worldview. In his lectures on Calvinism, he emphasized that the Christian faith is more than academic studies. Rather, it consumes everything. And it was at the inaugural lecture at the university that he started, called the Free University of Amsterdam, where he made probably the most famous quote of all in Kuyperian literature. He wrote more than 90 volumes, and this is a statement that he is most known for in all of his theological and academic accomplishments, and it goes like this, if you have not heard it before. There is not one part of our world, there is not one part of our world of thought that can be hermetically separated from other parts. And there is not an inch in the entire area of our human life of which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine, mine. Everything belongs to Jesus, every square inch. Kuyper was emphatic that every sphere of this present world, church, family, state, the three main spheres, that they do not derive their authority from themselves, but they derive whatever authority they have only from God. Because it's very easy to keep this idea of God's sovereignty over our personal salvation, but when Kuyper said that God is sovereign over every sphere of society, then that meant that parishioners, that parishes now needed to be invested in this calling of transforming society after the Word of God. And for Kuyper, that sphere theology, the idea that there are different spheres with distinct responsibility, he said that is the greatest way, the most profound way of keeping society, of preventing society from entering into a totalitarian state. A state in which the state would control everything, would demand everything, would have their hands in everything. No sphere is entitled to rule absolutely. The church had their limitations, the state had their limitations, the family had their limitations. The church could not interfere in the business of the state. The church, as Kuyper believed, could speak to issues of the state, but the church could not force the state's hand. The church could not have the state in her pocket, and most certainly the state could not have the church in her pocket. The state could not dictate, the state could not take away the religious freedom of the church to be whom God called her to be. Kuyper believed that in a country where spheres operated within the confines of God's authority, those countries would succeed. But on the other hand, countries where the influence of the Protestant Reformation was absent, countries where the influence of Calvinism was absent, they would not flourish. And he gave examples of totalitarian states of France and Russia in the 19th century, where there was very little trace of Protestantism left, that they fell into despotism, totalitarian states. And then shortly thereafter, in the life of Europe, we have the case of Hitler and Germany, who compromised, which church, the Lutheran Church, compromised and accepted the propositions of the state. And that synergy led to the rise of a tyrant. Kuyper believed that in a country where spheres operated within the confines of God's authority, only those countries would succeed because those countries understood what their God-given limitations were. James McGoldrick, one of Kuyper's famous biographers, he writes about Kuyper's vision in the Netherlands, and he says that Kuyper's desire for the Netherlands was that the nation would revive and persevere its Calvinistic heritage with its doctrine of limited state that respects the autonomy of all spheres of authority and thereby guaranteeing the freedom of its citizens. Kuyper believed that unless a society acknowledges the sovereignty of God, they will not be free. You need to acknowledge the freedom of God to be God before you are free yourself. And that doctrine was developed in this ideal that Kuyper speaks of in his writings. There's the doctrine of sphere sovereignty. Again, sphere sovereignty, as I mentioned, is the idea that there is a principle of limitation in each sphere of society. Again, the state is limited, the church is limited, the family is limited. Because the state has no idea what it means to be a good church. The church, therefore, Kuyper said, had to be free. And so the famous motto of Abraham Kuyper was, free church, free nation. The church's sphere should be free because this is the sphere in which God is most active, it says. And this entire principle of sphere sovereignty, again, stems from another famous ideal that Kuyper developed in his thinking. The idea of common grace. This is going to be important for us to grasp in preparation for the next 3 lectures here. The idea of common grace. For Kuyper, there was a distinction in how grace is manifested in society. First and foremost, there was special grace, and then there was common grace. Special grace and common grace. Special grace, think about things that happen within the realm of the church. Ecclesiastical matters. Those were special graces, redemptive graces. And then common grace were the things that were God's gifts to society, to political issues, to state issues, to family issues. So church life, special grace, and everything else, common grace. Now, Kuyper's critique of the Reformation, it can boil down to one central thing. He believed that the Reformation focused too much, maybe even exclusively, on special grace. That is, the Reformation, the 16th century in particular, spent too much time focusing on controversies regarding sacraments, baptism, church architecture, church polity, the role of the clergy, and a host of a lot of church issues. Now, to be clear, the Reformation did deal with issues outside of the church world, but what controversies was the Reformation responding to? Ecclesiastical controversies. The Reformation was a response to clerical, sacramental, ecclesiastical abuses in the 16th century. So obviously, those carried much greater weight in the writings of Calvin and Luther and Bucer. But when we get to the 19th century, there are ecclesiastical concerns, but Kuyper now wants to focus on something else. Because he's living in the 19th century Netherlands in a society of cultural confusion. And he doesn't think the church is preparing men and women to do their jobs well in the culture. He believed the church was so focused on its own internal disputes that they were not overflowing and blessing the culture, blessing society. So Kuyper develops this robust view of grace that focuses on the Christian's contribution to society as image bearers. And in some ways, he's reflecting a bit more of Luther's emphases rather than Calvin's emphases. So he would ask questions like, how do your painting skills reflect God's grace? If you are a painter, if you're an artist, if you're a politician, how are you applying your Christian faith to particular legislation? If you're a mother, do you realize how significant your role is in the home? How grace-filled your efforts are in the home? Kuyper wanted to see how the Christian faith would be applied not only internally in the church, but to the public theology of the church, to the public square, outside the walls of the church. And when he developed this idea, which is developed in hundreds and hundreds of pages, trust me, it's very well thought out. When he developed this idea and began to incorporate it into his writings, into his political world, his pastoral world, he was absolutely ridiculed and mocked in Dutch culture. They chastised him. Because they said, how dare you apply the lordship of Jesus to elements of society? Society is unredeemable. Society lives under a different way. It does not live under the prerogatives and the demands and the commands of the Holy Scriptures. They chastise them for this application. Kuyper, it is said, endured more in a lifetime than 100 public figures. Because when you apply the lordship of Jesus to all areas of life, you're going to get criticisms from all the critics of life. I've listened to hundreds of talks. I have read hundreds of pages. I have read works critiquing Kuyper. And my response at the end of the day is I always leave these conversations feeling more Kuyperian than I did the day before. Because the critics point out that pursuing the Christian view of life is antagonistic, is contrary to pluralism. And interesting enough, these critiques don't come only from secularists or non-reform. It comes from even those in the reformed world. There are theologies which I'll develop in the second lecture, like the radical two-kingdom theology, led by men like Michael Horton in California, who affirms that the church is an institution, a spiritual institution, but we as a church should have no bearing, or we should not speak or communicate into the political realm. We should leave that realm alone. That the church should mind her redemptive kingdom. The church should stay with her business of word and sacrament and leave the political things to the professionals, to the expert. Stay away from that world. Stay in your lane, pastors. That is one level of critique against Kuyper, but the other level also comes from our share of Anabaptist presuppositions that we have in the American evangelical world. People like Stanley Hauerwas, who find Kuyper's vision troubling because he believes that Abraham Kuyper has theocratic implications. If he only met us. Hauerwas says, it seems that this is a formula for having Christianity inextricably with a Constantinian project. He says Kuyper was wrong because he wanted to make the whole world the church and then use that world coercively against those who don't follow Christ. That's usually one way of determining what your views politically are today is, what do you think of Constantine? Good guy or bad guy? That says a lot. One critique says that the church has no business speaking to matters of the state, the two-kingdom world, and the other fears a Constantinian theocratic takeover. And after all these years of reading this Dutch theologian, I can point to certain areas of concern that maybe when I ask about some of his principles. The principle of pluralism, I think, can be perhaps navigated better than he did. Or how I wish Kuyper would emphasize more about the role of the church in the transformation of society, which he does, but not as much as I would like. But I think what you're going to see as you consider the life of Abraham Kuyper tonight is that the longevity of Kuyper's vision has produced more to advance the Christian cause than most of the post-Reformation theologians and practitioners in the 17th and 18th centuries combined. And that's sufficient to make his case. Kuyper was feared by Adolf Hitler because Adolf Hitler, to that point in his life, had never confronted a man who so desperately wanted to see Jesus and his lordship applied to every area of life. And so even though he had been dead for 20 years, the very reference to the name of Abraham Kuyper caused fear in the world's greatest tyrant. And it's interesting that you think of the great criticisms of Kuyperianism, they stem from pietism or escapism, and they all share this common bond of privatizing the faith. Of privatizing the faith. The faith is mine. The faith is internalized. Leave my faith alone. I can do whatever I want with it. I don't need to reveal it. I don't need to show it. I can keep it to myself. But I want to conclude by painting a picture of Kuyper's lasting legacy for the church today. And I will offer just very briefly 4 elements of Kuyper's life that I think are lasting for us to consider. The first one is that Kuyper reintroduced to the world, specifically the Dutch world, a powerful way of defending the faith. This was later developed by another Dutchman who lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, by the name of Cornelius Van Til. And we call that method of defending the faith presuppositionalism, which for Kuyper, it was the principle of no neutrality. There is no neutrality. You are either for God or against God. There are no brute facts. Every fact reflects the wisdom of God, or it reflects disdain for God. He was at the forefront of defending the faith in his own day, appealing not to common sense or consensus or natural law, but appealing to the cultural mandate in Genesis 1 and the Great Commission in Matthew 28. But secondly, Kuyper was instrumental in thinking about education and culture from a Christian perspective. And we have him to thank, in many ways, for the educational revolution taking place in our Christian society today, here in the United States in particular. We have the chance to plant a congregation in South Brazil, in a city called Porto Alegre in South Brazil. And when we planted that church in 2014, there were approximately 100 families homeschooling in Brazil. Now there are over 3,000 families homeschooling in Brazil. And I'm delighted to say that that little CREC congregation we planted in South Brazil was very instrumental in the promulgation of Christian education, specifically classical education. You know what they all had in common? They were all Kuyperians. They were all Kuyperians. Kuyper opposed the Anabaptists who believed that we needed to retreat, that we needed to seclude ourselves from the world. He believed that Christians needed to equip themselves, that they needed to, quote, push the development of this world to constant agreement with God's ordinances. And Kuyper said the way to establish a Christian culture anywhere is to begin by educating the Christian populace. Christian children receive Christian education. You can't teach math apart from God because math implies order, and God is the creation of order. So not only did he encourage the founding, the starting of private Christian education, but he started one of the finest colleges in the day, the Free University of Amsterdam, because he wanted to see that the entire education of the Christian was holistic. He believed there was no neutrality. He emphasized the necessity of Christian education. And Kuyper, thirdly, was a localist. He believed in limited government. And the reason he believed that government was to be limited was because he believed that freedom is exercised best at the local level. Those guys, I'm not too far from D.C. here, those guys nearby don't control or have a clue about what happens in Pensacola, Florida. But we do. And so what did he do? He started a political party as a way of navigating the totalitarian tendencies of the Dutch state. Kuyper said that the kingdom of God is present in the local activities of the local church. That changing the world does not demand running for politics or becoming a priest. Changing the world begins in your home. And that's why Kuyper was known as the bell ringer of the common people. The one who brought consensus among the farmer, among those who were despised in society, among the poor. Kuyper wanted the church to be a sending out station, a place from which people would be trained, educated to change their communities. And finally, Kuyper taught that our labor is significant to our God. Whether we paint, whether we preach, whether we plant trees, Kuyper taught that all these things were spiritual activities with overwhelming effect in the kingdom of God. That the day-to-day travel to work and home, the diaper change, the duties of children, the playing, the plugging, the plowing, our labor is not in vain in the Lord, as Paul says. And that my job, Pastor Hurt's job as a minister, is not more important or more spiritual than yours. Poverty is not to be treasured over riches. Riches are not to be treasured over poverty. Kuyper stressed the common themes of the Reformation era. And he expanded them greatly into other areas of society that both Luther and Calvin never fathomed applying. Abraham Kuyper believed that isolationism was not an option. That your life, was not to be divided into little sections or pockets. Well, here's my piety on Sunday. Here's my work on Monday. Here's my feasting on Friday. And never shall they meet. No, everything needed to be oriented. Everything needed to be directed towards the glory of Jesus Christ. Your piety, your feasting, your golfing, your fishing, all these things need to submit to King Jesus. Even though this message may be common to us here this evening, it is absolutely foreign to my culture in the South, and probably to your evangelical culture here. Because evangelicals are not used to thinking this comprehensive fashion, but Kuyper labored tirelessly to see this vision expounded in the Netherlands and eventually overflowing into the United States through his lectures. He was my favorite theologian of the people. And as a result, he ran as a leader of a political party, founded a denomination. He was a newspaper editorialist. And if Kuyper were alive today, he would start all sorts of things. He would get into all sorts of trouble. He would run for office. He would engage local activities. He would make all the right people mad at him. So I commend you to the life of Abraham Kuyper as a model for civil and cultural discourse in a day when too many in our Christian world have given up on the world. Kuyperianism, as I wrote 17 years ago, continues to be a loud call to cultural engagement by declaring that every single inch of this universe belongs to Jesus Christ, and he declares to be his and no other. Let's pray together. Our Father and our God, we give thanks for the life of Abraham Kuyper. We give thanks for your mercy in protecting and for giving this man almost divine stamina to do everything he did. We are inspired by his life, but we do not divinize his life, but we give thanks for his life because he was a life given over to the King of Kings, whose energy is boundless, whose mercies are free, and whose grace is never ending. And we give praise to you, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.